He bought a storm-destroyed shack for pennies. Everyone called him insane, but what he found inside would change his life forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. What city are you watching from? I love connecting with viewers from around the world. 6 months ago, Marco Valenti was untouchable. His restaurant Celestial sat at the top of every food critic's list. 3 Michelin stars gleamed like diamonds on his wall. Celebrity chefs called him for advice. Food Network begged him for shows. Marco was cooking royalty. Every dish that left his kitchen was pure art. Every reservation was booked 3 months ahead. Every meal cost more than most people's rent. But success has a way of making enemies. The scandal broke on a Tuesday morning. Food and Wine magazine's front page screamed the headline that destroyed him. Fake genius, Marco Valenti, accused of recipe theft. The article was brutal. Former sous chefs came forward with recordings, photos of handwritten recipes that supposedly belonged to his deceased mentor, Giuseppe Romano. Claims that Marco had stolen Giuseppe's life work and built his empire on lies. Marco's phone exploded with calls. Reporters camped outside his apartment. Social media turned into a battlefield. Marco lied trended worldwide within hours. The first domino fell fast. His investors pulled out. The restaurant's landlord terminated his lease. Food critics who once praised him now wrote scathing reviews calling him a fraud. Marco tried to fight back. He held press conferences. He showed his own notebooks, his years of training, his innovations. But the internet had already decided. He was guilty. His staff quit one by one. His girlfriend left him for a food blogger who had written one of the hit pieces. His bank accounts froze as lawsuits piled up like autumn leaves. Within 3 weeks, Marco Valenti went from culinary king to complete nobody. The final blow came on a Friday evening. Marco stood in his empty restaurant, looking at the bare walls where his awards once hung. The silence was deafening. No sizzling pans, no laughing customers, no life. His lawyer called with the last bit of bad news. The civil suits would take everything. His savings, his apartment, even his car. Marco had exactly $847 left to his name. That night, Marco packed everything that mattered into 2 suitcases, some clothes, a few kitchen knives that had been his father's, a photo of his parents who had died believing their son would be the greatest chef in America. He bought a bus ticket to the coast, anywhere away from the cameras and the shame, away from the life that had crumbled like a house of cards. The bus pulled away from the city at dawn. Marco pressed his face against the window and watched his old world disappear. He was 38 years old and starting over with less than $800. The coastal town of Gulls Bay wasn't on any tourist map. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear. Perfect for Marco. He rented a tiny room above a bait shop for $200 a week. The smell of fish was constant, but it was better than the smell of failure that had followed him everywhere. For 2 months, Marco washed dishes at a diner. The owner, Betty, didn't recognize him or care about his past. She paid him cash and let him work in peace. But every night, Marco walked the old pier. The salt air cleared his head. The sound of waves crashing reminded him why he had fallen in love with cooking in the first place. The ocean was honest. It didn't lie or cheat or steal credit. It just was. One evening, as storm clouds gathered overhead, Marco noticed something he'd never seen before. At the very end of the pier, hidden behind overgrown weeds and broken boards, stood the skeleton of what had once been a building. The next morning, he asked Betty about it. "That old place?" She laughed. "Hurricane Delilah took it apart 2 years ago. Used to be the finest restaurant on the whole coast. Owner died in the storm trying to save his recipes." Marco's heart skipped. A restaurant. Destroyed but not dead. "Who owns it now?" Betty shrugged. "City's been trying to sell it for months. Nobody wants it. Too much damage. Too much money to fix." That afternoon, Marco walked to the end of the pier again. This time he pushed through the weeds and stepped inside the ruins. The roof was mostly gone. Windows were shattered. Tables and chairs lay scattered like broken dreams. But in the back, behind a door hanging off its hinges, was a kitchen. A destroyed kitchen. But still a kitchen. Marco felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. The next day, he called the city office. The asking price made him laugh. $3,000. less than he used to spend on wine for one dinner service. "You want to buy that death trap?" the clerk asked. "Mister, that place is condemned. One good wind and it'll blow into the ocean." Marco didn't care. For the first time since the scandal, he saw a future, a chance to cook again, a chance to start over. He had exactly $3,200 left from his dishwashing wages. "I'll take it," he said. Everyone called him insane. Betty shook her head. The city clerk made him sign extra paperwork acknowledging the risks. Local fishermen bet on how long it would take the building to collapse. But Marco had made his choice. He was going to rebuild. He was going to cook again. He had no idea what was waiting for him inside those broken walls. The next morning, Marco met Sarah Jenkins at the pier. She was the real estate agent handling the property, and she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Valenti, I have to be honest with you," she said, clutching her clipboard against the wind. "This is the worst property I've ever tried to sell, and I once sold a house that was half burned down." Sarah was in her 50s with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many bad deals. She wore a bright yellow raincoat that made her look like a walking caution sign. "Just show me what I'm buying," Marco said. They walked to the end of the pier together. The old restaurant sat like a broken tooth against the gray sky. Up close, the damage was even worse than Marco had imagined. "The original owner was Giuseppe Romano," Sarah began. Marco's blood turned to ice. Giuseppe Romano. His mentor. The man he was accused of stealing from. "You knew him?" Sarah asked, noticing Marco's reaction. "We worked together years ago." Sarah nodded. "Giuseppe bought this place 15 years ago, turned it into the most beautiful restaurant on the coast. Romano's by the sea. People drove from 3 states away just to eat here." She pointed to the broken foundation. "Hurricane Delilah hit 2 years ago. Category 4. Giuseppe refused to evacuate, said he wouldn't leave his life's work." Marco's throat tightened. "What happened to him?" "They found him in the kitchen the next morning. Heart attack. The stress of watching his restaurant get destroyed, it killed him." Sarah pulled out a thick folder of papers. "Giuseppe had no family, no heirs. The city took possession after the funeral. We've been trying to sell it ever since." She flipped through photos of the restaurant before the storm. Marco's breath caught. It was beautiful. Wooden floors polished to a mirror shine. Windows facing the ocean. A kitchen that looked like a chef's dream. The dining room seated 60, full bar, wine cellar in the basement that somehow survived the storm. The kitchen equipment is destroyed, but the space itself has good bones. Marco studied the photos. In one, he could see Giuseppe's familiar handwriting on a chalkboard menu. The same careful script Marco remembered from their days working together in New York. "Why is it so cheap?" Marco asked. Sarah laughed bitterly. "Because it's a money pit. The roof needs complete replacement. The electrical system is fried. Plumbing is shot. The city inspector says it'll cost at least $50,000 to make it safe, and double that to make it functional. So why hasn't the city just torn it down?" Giuseppe's will had a strange clause. He wanted the building to go to someone who would cook there again. Not a developer. Not someone who'd turn it into condos. Someone who would honor what it was. Marco felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean wind. 3 months ago, we had a buyer, real estate developer from Boston. He was going to tear it down and build luxury apartments. But the deal fell through at the last minute. His lawyer found some legal issues with the will. Sarah handed Marco the keys. "Want to look inside?" The front door hung crooked on broken hinges. Marco pushed it open and stepped into what had once been Giuseppe's dream. The damage was catastrophic. Debris covered everything. Broken glass crunched under their feet. The ocean had torn through the dining room like an angry fist. But Marco could see past the destruction. The layout was perfect. Windows positioned to catch the morning light. A natural flow from dining room to kitchen. Even in ruins, the space had soul. "The wine cellar is through here," Sarah said, leading him to a narrow staircase. They descended into darkness. Sarah clicked on a flashlight. The basement was surprisingly intact. Stone walls had protected it from the storm. Dozens of empty wine racks stood like soldiers in formation. Giuseppe had over 3,000 bottles down here, all destroyed by flooding. Marco ran his fingers along the stone walls. They were solid, built to last. Back upstairs, they made their way to the kitchen. Marco's heart hammered as they approached the swinging doors. The kitchen was a war zone, stoves overturned, refrigerators twisted like metal sculptures, pots and pans scattered everywhere. But the space itself was huge, twice the size of most restaurant kitchens. The hood system will need complete replacement, Sarah said. New gas lines, new electrical. It's going to be expensive. Marco wasn't listening. He was staring at something on the far wall, a small handwritten sign that had somehow survived the storm. Cook with love, or don't cook at all. Giuseppe. I'll take it, Marco said suddenly. Sarah blinked. Don't you want to think about it? Get an inspection? Talk to a contractor? No, I want it, today. 2 hours later, they sat in Sarah's car filling out paperwork. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. You sure about this? Sarah asked one last time. This place has beaten every contractor who's looked at it. The pier itself needs reinforcement. One bad storm and you could lose everything. Marco signed his name with a flourish. I've already lost everything once. What's the worst that could happen? Sarah shook her head but stamped the papers. Giuseppe's will had one more condition. The new owner had to promise to cook there within 1 year, or the city could reclaim it. That won't be a problem. Marco handed over every dollar he had left. $3,200 in cash. Everything he'd saved from washing dishes. Sarah counted it twice. Congratulations, Mr. Valenti. You now own the most expensive pile of debris on the East Coast. That evening, Marco stood alone in his ruined restaurant. The sun was setting over the ocean, painting the broken walls orange and gold. He had no money for repairs, no equipment, no plan. Just a dream and a building that was falling down around him. But for the first time in months, Marco felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He pulled out his phone and took a photo of Giuseppe's sign. Then he typed a message to himself. Day 1. Begin again. As night fell, Marco walked through his new kingdom one more time. Tomorrow he would start planning. Tomorrow he would figure out how to turn ruins into dreams. Tonight he just wanted to listen to the ocean and remember why he'd fallen in love with cooking in the first place. He had no idea he wasn't alone in the building. Marco returned at dawn the next morning, carrying a thermos of coffee and a notebook full of repair plans. The morning mist rolled off the ocean like ghostly fingers, wrapping around the broken restaurant. He pushed through the front door, ready to start measuring and planning. But something was different. Wrong. A pot sat upright on the kitchen counter. Yesterday, everything had been scattered on the floor. Marco was sure of it. He stood perfectly still, listening. The building creaked in the wind. But there was something else. A sound so soft he almost missed it. Breathing. Marco's heart pounded. Hello? He called out. Is someone there? Silence. He moved toward the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The breathing sound came again. Definitely human. Definitely scared. I'm not going to hurt you, Marco said softly. I just bought this place. I own it now. A crash came from behind the overturned refrigerator. Someone was hiding back there. Marco approached slowly, hands visible. Come out, please. I just want to talk. Nothing. Then a small voice whispered in accented English. Go away. Marco knelt down, making himself smaller and less threatening. I'm not going anywhere. This is my restaurant now, but I'm not angry. I just want to know who you are. A long pause. Then 2 pairs of eyes appeared in the gap behind the refrigerator. Big, dark, frightened eyes. My name is Marco, he said gently. What are your names? The eyes disappeared again. Hushed Spanish whispers echoed from their hiding spot. After 5 minutes of patient waiting, a girl emerged first. She looked about 12, with long black hair and clothes that had seen better days. Her face was streaked with dirt, but her eyes burned with fierce intelligence. Luisa, she said, chin raised defiantly. This is Carlos. A smaller boy appeared behind her. 8 years old, maybe 9. He clutched a stuffed bear that was missing one eye. His face was round and sweet, but terror filled his expression. We're not hurting anything, Luisa said quickly. We'll leave. Just don't call the police. Marco's chest tightened. These were children. Hungry, scared, desperate children. When did you last eat? He asked. Luisa's defiance cracked slightly. Yesterday, we found some crackers in the bait shop dumpster. Marco sat down on a piece of debris, making himself their height. How long have you been living here? Luisa looked at Carlos, then back at Marco. Something in his voice must have convinced her he wasn't a threat. 3 months, she whispered, since they took Mama and Papa. The story came out in broken pieces. Their parents had worked at a fish processing plant in town. Illegal immigrants from Honduras who'd been here for 8 years. They'd built a life, rented a small apartment, sent their kids to school. Then ICE came. They took them at work, Luisa said, tears starting to flow. Carlos was at school. I was walking home. Our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, she saw the van. She called me and told me to run. Carlos hadn't said a word, but he moved closer to his sister. Mrs. Chen hid us for a week, but she was scared, said she could get in trouble. So we left. Why here? Marco asked. The other homeless people downtown, they're mean. They steal food. This place was empty, quiet. The basement doesn't flood anymore. Marco's throat felt tight. Have you been to school? Luisa shook her head. Can't. They'll ask questions. Find out we're alone. Marco looked around the destroyed kitchen with new eyes. Now he saw the signs of habitation. A corner where they'd made a bed from old tablecloths. Canned food stashed behind loose boards. A small camping stove hidden under debris. How do you get food? I work sometimes, Luisa said proudly. Clean fish at the docks. They pay cash. And Carlos, he's good at finding things people throw away. Carlos finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. We don't steal. I know you don't, Marco said. You're survivors, both of you. The children exchanged glances. They weren't used to adults who didn't see them as problems to be solved. Where are your parents now? Marco asked gently. Luisa's face hardened. Deported. Back to Honduras. We don't know where exactly. They took them to a detention center first. Then, she shrugged helplessly. Have you tried to contact them? How? We don't have phones. Don't know which center. Don't know anything. Her voice broke. They probably think we're dead. Marco stood up slowly. Are you hungry right now? Both children nodded, though Luisa tried to hide it. I'm going to get food, real food. Will you wait here? Why? Luisa asked suspiciously. What do you want? Marco looked at these two brave, broken children who'd survived 3 months in a ruined building, who'd taken care of each other when the world abandoned them. I want to help, he said simply. I want to make you breakfast. We don't have money to pay you. I'm not asking for money. Marco pulled out his phone and showed them the photo he'd taken yesterday. Giuseppe's handwritten sign, cook with love or don't cook at all. The man who owned this restaurant before, he was my teacher. He believed food was about more than business. It was about taking care of people. Luisa stared at the photo. Giuseppe was nice. He used to give us leftover bread when we were little, before the storm. Marco's heart stopped. You knew Giuseppe? He taught Carlos how to crack eggs without breaking the yolks. Said he was a natural. Carlos spoke up again, slightly braver now. Giuseppe said cooking was magic, turned simple things into happiness. Marco knelt down again, looking both children in the eyes. I have a proposition. I'm going to rebuild this restaurant. It's going to take months of work. I could use help. Someone to hand me tools. Someone to keep the place clean. Someone to test recipes when I start cooking again. Luisa was immediately suspicious. What's the catch? No catch. You help me, I help you. We figure it out together. We can't pay rent. Don't want rent. I want partners. The word hung in the air between them. Partners. Not charity cases. Not problems to be fixed. Partners. You're serious? Luisa asked. Dead serious. But there are rules. You have to let me buy groceries. You have to help with the work. And you have to trust me. Carlos tugged on his sister's shirt and whispered something in Spanish. Luisa's eyes filled with tears. He wants to know if you'll teach him to cook, like Giuseppe did. Marco smiled for the first time in months. I'll teach you both everything I know. Why? Luisa asked. Why would you help us? Marco looked around the ruined restaurant, at the broken dreams and scattered hopes, at two children who'd lost everything but still found ways to survive. Because, he said, I think we all need a family. Neither child spoke for a long moment. Then Carlos stepped forward and took Marco's hand. Okay, Luisa said quietly. Partners. Marco had come here to rebuild a restaurant. Instead, he'd found something infinitely more valuable. He'd found his reason to fight. For 3 weeks, life felt almost normal. Marco, Luisa, and Carlos had fallen into a routine that surprised them all with its simplicity. Marco would arrive each morning with groceries and coffee. The children would emerge from their makeshift bedroom in the basement. Together, they'd work on clearing debris, sorting salvageable items, and planning the restaurant's rebirth. Luisa proved to have a natural eye for organization. She created inventory lists and mapped out the kitchen layout. Carlos, despite his quiet nature, showed remarkable skill with tools. Giuseppe had been right. The boy was a natural, but the best part was the cooking. Every afternoon, Marco would set up his camping stove and teach them recipes. Not fancy restaurant dishes, but real food. Comfort food. The kind of meals that felt like hugs. Cooking is about more than following directions, Marco told them while teaching Carlos to dice onions. It's about understanding, tasting, feeling when something is right. Carlos would nod solemnly, his small hands carefully gripping the knife. Luisa would roll her eyes at her brother's intensity, but Marco could see her taking mental notes too. They were becoming a family, not officially, not legally, but in all the ways that mattered. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. Marco was showing Luisa how to calculate food costs when they heard it. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. All movement stopped. Luisa's face went white. Carlos dropped behind the counter instinctively. "Stay here," Marco whispered. "Don't make a sound." Marco walked to the front door, his heart hammering. Through the broken window, he could see 2 people in official-looking uniforms, immigration and customs enforcement. ICE. He opened the door with what he hoped was a casual smile. "Can I help you?" The lead agent was a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. Her badge read, Agent Martinez. "We're looking for 2 children," she said, showing him photos. "Luisa and Carlos Hernandez. We have reports they've been seen in this area." Marco's blood turned to ice, but he kept his expression neutral. "Haven't seen them. Sorry." Agent Martinez studied his face carefully. "Mind if we look around? This building's been abandoned. Good place for homeless kids to hide." "Actually, it's not abandoned anymore. I bought it." The second agent, younger and more aggressive, stepped forward. "You got papers proving that?" Marco pulled out the deed from his jacket pocket. "Bought it 3 weeks ago. I'm renovating it." Agent Martinez examined the paperwork. "Marco Valenti, says here you're opening a restaurant." "That's the plan." "Alone?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Marco could feel the children listening from the kitchen. One wrong word and they'd be discovered. "For now, yes." Agent Martinez handed back the deed. "We'd still like to look around. Won't take long." Marco's mind raced. The children's belongings were scattered throughout the building. Their makeshift bedroom in the basement would be impossible to hide. "Of course," he said, stepping aside. "Though I should warn you, it's dangerous. Lots of debris. Building's not structurally sound yet." The agents entered, flashlights ready. They moved systematically through the dining room, checking behind overturned tables and in dark corners. Marco followed, his palms sweating. Any moment now they'd find something. A child's drawing, Carlos's stuffed bear. Evidence that would destroy the fragile family he'd found. They reached the kitchen. Agent Martinez shone her light around the space. She stopped at the corner where the children usually worked. A small stool sat next to the prep counter. "Someone's been cooking here," she observed. "That would be me," Marco said. "I test recipes." The younger agent picked up a child-sized apron that Carlos had left on a hook. "This is pretty small for you." Marco's throat went dry. Think. Think fast. "It was here when I bought the place. Giuseppe Romano, the previous owner, he had grandchildren who visited sometimes." Agent Martinez nodded, but her eyes remained suspicious. "We're going to check the basement." This was it. Game over. The children's bedroom was down there, along with 3 months of accumulated belongings. As they headed for the basement stairs, Marco heard the softest sound from behind the walk-in freezer. A muffled cough. Both agents froze. "What was that?" the younger one demanded. Marco's heart stopped. In that moment, he made a choice that would change everything. "That would be my kids," Marco said calmly. Both agents spun around. "Your kids? Luisa! Carlos! Come out here, please." Silence stretched like a taut wire. Then slowly, Luisa emerged from behind the freezer. Carlos followed, clutching his bear. "These are the children you're looking for?" Agent Martinez asked. "These are my children," Marco said firmly. "Luisa and Carlos Valenti." The younger agent frowned. "They don't look like you." "They're adopted," Marco said without missing a beat. "My late wife's children from her first marriage. I've been raising them since she died." Luisa stared at Marco in shock. Carlos pressed closer to his sister. Agent Martinez studied the scene carefully. "You have adoption papers?" Marco's mind raced. "At my apartment. I can get them if you need to see them." "Where's your apartment?" "Above the bait shop on Harbor Street. We've been staying there while I renovate this place." The agents exchanged glances. Something wasn't adding up, but they couldn't put their finger on what. "Kids," Agent Martinez said gently. "What are your names?" Luisa lifted her chin with that fierce defiance Marco had come to love. "Luisa Valenti." Carlos whispered, "Carlos Valenti." "And this is your dad?" Both children looked at Marco. In their eyes he saw trust, hope, and something that looked like love. "Yes," Luisa said clearly. "He's our papa." Agent Martinez wasn't convinced. "Mr. Valenti, I need to see some identification. Birth certificates for the children. Proof of custody." "Of course," Marco said. "Everything's back at the apartment. Should I get it now?" "We'll follow you." This was the moment Marco realized how deep he was in. He'd just claimed legal custody of two children he'd known for 3 weeks. If they called his bluff, everyone would be in trouble. But as they walked toward the door, Carlos slipped his small hand into Marco's. Luisa moved to his other side, protective and proud. They looked like a family. They felt like a family. Maybe that would be enough. "Papa," Carlos said quietly, "are we in trouble?" Marco squeezed his hand. "No, mijo. We're going to be fine." It was the first time he'd used the Spanish word for my son. It felt right. As they left the restaurant together, Marco caught Luisa looking up at him with something like amazement. "Why?" she whispered. Marco didn't hesitate. "Because families protect each other." For the first time since he'd met her, Luisa smiled. A real smile. They walked toward Harbor Street as a family. Marco had no idea how he was going to convince the agents he was their legal guardian. He had no papers, no proof, no plan. But he had something more important. He had two children who just called him Papa, and he would do anything, lie, cheat, steal, or fight, to keep them safe. The most important recipe of his life was about to begin, and the main ingredient was love. Marco's hands shook as he rifled through the box of documents he'd brought from New York. Birth certificates, social security cards, marriage license from his brief marriage 5 years ago. Everything except what he needed. The ICE agents waited in his tiny apartment above the bait shop. Luisa and Carlos sat on the narrow bed, trying to look like children who belonged there. "The adoption papers," Agent Martinez said impatiently. "Where are they?" Marco's mind raced. Then buried at the bottom of the box he found it. A folder marked legal documents that he'd never bothered to open. Inside, mixed with old tax returns, was a letter from a family court in Honduras. It was in Spanish, faded, official-looking. Marco's heart hammered as he handed it over. "Here." Agent Martinez studied the document, frowning. "This is in Spanish. The adoption was processed through Honduran courts before my wife died," Marco said, praying his voice sounded steady. "She wanted the children to maintain their cultural identity." The younger agent peered over his partner's shoulder. "We'd need this translated and verified." "Of course," Marco said. "I can get certified translations within a week." What Marco didn't tell them was that the document was actually a custody agreement from Giuseppe's estate, old paperwork that had nothing to do with children, but it looked official enough to buy him time. Agent Martinez closed her notebook. "Mr. Valenti, we'll be back in 7 days for those translations. If everything checks out, we're done here." After they left, the three of them sat in silence for 10 minutes. Finally, Carlos whispered, "Are we safe now?" Marco pulled both children close. "We're going to be." The next morning, they returned to the restaurant with new purpose. They weren't just 3 people sharing space anymore. They were a family with something to protect. Marco had spent the night researching how to forge adoption papers. It was illegal, dangerous, and exactly what he planned to do. These children were his now, and no government agency was going to change that. But first, they had a restaurant to build. Today we start the real work, Marco announced, spreading blueprints across a makeshift table. Kitchen first. We need working equipment before we can think about opening. Luisa studied the plans with the intensity of an architect. The gas line runs here? Exactly. Can you measure from the wall to where the stove will go? She grabbed the tape measure like she'd been born with it in her hand. Carlos followed, ready to hold the other end. Watching them work together, Marco felt something shift in his chest. For months after the scandal, he'd lost his purpose. Now he was building something that mattered. 2 weeks into the renovation, Marco decided they needed a break from construction. The kitchen wasn't finished, but his camping stove could handle a proper cooking lesson. Today, he announced, we're making your first professional dish. What are we cooking? Carlos asked, his eyes bright with excitement. Arroz con pollo, but not your grandmother's version, a version that tells your story. Marco had learned the importance of food that meant something. Every dish should connect to memory, to emotion, to home. He showed them how to toast the rice until it sang in the pan, how to layer flavors so each bite told a different part of the story, how to taste as they went, adjusting seasoning like composers, writing music. Cooking is about more than following recipes, Marco explained, watching Carlos carefully stir the sofrito. It's about understanding who you're cooking for, what they need, what will make them feel loved. Luisa added the chicken to the pot, her movements growing more confident. Giuseppe used to say cooking was like magic. He was right. We take simple ingredients and transform them into memories. When the dish was finished, they sat on overturned crates and ate together. The arroz con pollo was perfect. Not restaurant perfect, but family perfect. It tasted like home. Carlos took a bite and smiled. It tastes like mama's. Luisa's eyes filled with tears. But better. By month 2, the restaurant was starting to look like a restaurant again. Marco had maxed out 3 credit cards and sold everything he owned, but they had running water, working electricity, and a functional kitchen. The children had become his secret weapons. Luisa could organize anything and had a natural head for numbers. Carlos possessed an instinctive understanding of flavors that amazed Marco daily. Try this, Carlos would say, offering a spoonful of sauce he'd been working on. Every time, it was perfect. Not good for an 8-year-old. Perfect, period. How do you know to add the cumin? Marco asked one afternoon. Carlos shrugged. The sauce told me it was lonely. Marco had trained under famous chefs who couldn't explain seasoning that well. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Money was constantly tight. The building inspector found new problems weekly. And every morning, Marco woke up terrified that someone would discover their secret. Marco found the forger through a contact from his dishwashing days, a man named Eddie who specialized in helping undocumented workers get legitimate jobs. You want me to create adoption papers that will fool federal agents? Eddie asked, studying the original Honduran document. That's not fake IDs for restaurant work. That's serious federal crime territory. How much? Marco asked simply. 5,000. And if you get caught, you never heard my name. Marco didn't have $5,000, but he had his father's watch, a Rolex that had been in the family for 3 generations. Will this cover it? Eddie examined the watch and nodded. Give me a week. 7 days later, Marco held perfect adoption papers declaring Luisa and Carlos Valenti his legal children. The documents looked like they'd been filed in Honduran family court 3 years earlier. When Agent Martinez returned, she examined every page with a magnifying glass. She made phone calls. She ran background checks. Finally, she handed the papers back. Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Valenti. Sorry to have bothered you. After she left, Marco collapsed into a chair. They'd done it. The children were officially his. Papa, Luisa said softly, what happens now? Marco looked around their restaurant. The kitchen gleamed. The dining room was taking shape. For the first time in a year, he could see the future. Now, he said, we cook. They weren't officially open yet, but word had spread through the small town. The famous chef who'd bought Giuseppe's old place was cooking again. Betty from the diner stopped by one evening, drawn by the smells coming from the kitchen. Whatever you're making smells like heaven, she said. Marco emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. Luisa and Carlos flanked him like sous chefs. "We're testing recipes," Marco explained. "Want to try something?" Betty tasted the fish stew Carlos had helped create. Her eyes widened. "Sweet mother of pearl, this is incredible." Word spread faster than seasoning through hot oil. Soon people were showing up every evening, hoping for a taste of whatever magic was happening in the old Romano's kitchen. Marco realized they weren't just building a restaurant anymore. They were building a community, a place where food brought people together, where every dish was made with love. Standing in his kitchen, watching his children work beside him, Marco finally understood what Giuseppe's sign had meant. They weren't just cooking with love, they were cooking love itself into existence. It was a Tuesday evening, 6 months after the adoption papers had been approved. The restaurant was bustling with its usual crowd of locals and tourists who discovered their hidden gem. Marco was in the kitchen, teaching Carlos how to plate the signature fish dish, when his phone rang. The caller ID made his blood freeze. Food and Wine magazine, the same publication that had destroyed his career. "Marco Valenti?" The voice was crisp, professional. "This is Jennifer Walsh, senior writer. We're doing a feature on comeback stories. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Marco's hands shook as he stepped into the storage room for privacy. "What kind of questions?" "Our sources say you're running an incredible restaurant with your adopted children. Very inspiring story. We'd love to feature you in our next issue." "I'm not interested." "Come on, Marco. America loves a redemption story. Famous chef loses everything, adopts 2 kids, builds a new dream. It's perfect." Through the kitchen window, Marco could see Luisa explaining wine pairings to a customer. Carlos was carefully garnishing plates with the precision of a trained chef. His children, his family. "I said no. We're running the story either way," Jennifer said, her tone shifting. "With or without your cooperation. But I thought you'd want to control the narrative." The line went dead. Marco stared at his phone, his world tilting sideways. Over the next week, reporters started showing up in Gulls Bay. They asked questions at the bait shop, the diner, the harbor office. Friendly questions that felt like traps. "Cute kids Marco's got. Do they look like him to you? Ever see any adoption paperwork? Funny how they showed up right after he did." Betty cornered Marco at the market. "You got vultures circling, honey. What's going on?" Marco couldn't tell her the truth. Couldn't tell anyone. So he just smiled and said, "Reporters looking for a story where there isn't one." But Luisa was 12 and sharp as her father's best knife. She caught the fear in Marco's eyes, the way he checked over his shoulder, the tension that crept into his movements. "Papa," she said one evening after the restaurant closed, "are we in trouble?" Carlos looked up from his homework, sensing the shift in mood. Marco knelt down to their level. "Some people want to write about our restaurant, about our family, but they don't understand us." "What don't they understand?" Luisa pressed. "They think family has to look a certain way, come from certain places. But we know better, don't we?" Carlos nodded solemnly. "Family is who takes care of you." "Exactly, mijo." The Food and Wine article hit the internet on a Thursday morning. The headline made Marco's stomach drop. "Fake family? The troubling questions behind Marco Valenti's comeback story." The piece was brutal. It questioned everything. The timing of the adoption, the children's appearance, the convenient story of a dead wife. It stopped just short of accusing Marco outright, but the implications were clear. By noon, the restaurant phone was ringing nonstop. Reporters, government officials, child services. Marco turned off the phone and locked the doors. "Are we hiding again?" Carlos asked, his voice small. "Just for today," Marco said. "Until I figure this out." But hiding wasn't going to solve anything. By evening, news vans had arrived. Camera crews set up across from the restaurant. The vultures had found their prey. The next morning, Marco prepared for the worst. He'd called a lawyer, though he couldn't afford one. He'd mentally prepared for the children to be taken away. He'd accepted that his second chance at happiness was over. What he hadn't prepared for was Betty standing on his doorstep at 6 a.m. with a casserole and fire in her eyes. "Those jackals want a story?" she said, pushing past him into the restaurant. "I'll give them a story." By 8 a.m., the restaurant was full, not with reporters, but with locals. The fisherman Marco bought supplies from. the elderly couple who came for dinner every Friday, the teacher who'd started bringing her kids for cooking lessons. Old Murphy, who ran the bait shop, stood up and addressed the cameras through the window. You want to know about Marco Valenti? He's the man who saved two kids nobody else wanted. He's the man who brought life back to this dead building. He's family. Sarah, the real estate agent who'd sold him the property, pushed through the crowd. I've got something to say to those reporters. She marched outside and faced the cameras directly. Marco Valenti is the best thing that ever happened to this town. Those children were living in ruins before he found them. Now look at them. Through the window, the cameras captured Luisa and Carlos working side by side in the kitchen, confident and loved and home. The confrontation came that afternoon. A child services investigator arrived with two police officers and a court order. Mr. Valenti, we need to speak with the children, separately. Marco's heart shattered. This was it. After everything they'd built, it was ending. But Luisa stepped forward before he could speak. You want to talk to us about Papa? The investigator was a tired-looking woman named Miss Rodriguez. We need to verify your living situation. Make sure you're being properly cared for. We are, Carlos said firmly. Papa takes care of us. Tell me about your life before Mr. Valenti. Luisa lifted her chin with that familiar defiance. We were alone, scared, hungry. Now we have a family. But he's not your biological father. So what? Luisa's voice carried the strength of someone who'd grown up too fast. He chose us. We chose him. Isn't that what family means? Ms. Rodriguez looked around the restaurant, at the photos on the walls showing the children's growth, at their homework station in the corner, at the love visible in every detail. Carlos, are you happy here? Carlos nodded so hard his whole body moved. Papa teaches me to cook. He reads me stories. He hugs me when I have nightmares about Mama and Papa being taken away. And if I told you that you might have to go live somewhere else? Both children moved closer to Marco instinctively. This is our home, Luisa said fiercely. Papa's our family. You can't take us away from our family. Ms. Rodriguez spent 3 hours at the restaurant. She interviewed the children separately and together. She examined their living quarters upstairs. She talked to Betty, to Sarah, to customers who'd become regulars. Finally, she sat down with Marco. The adoption papers check out legally, she said. The children are clearly well cared for. They're thriving. Marco held his breath. But more than that, she continued, they're loved. And they love you. Whatever brought you all together, you've created something real here. She closed her file. Case closed. No further investigation needed. As the official vehicles drove away, the community erupted in cheers. Betty hugged Marco so hard his ribs cracked. The children pressed against his sides like they'd never let go. That evening, they cooked dinner for everyone who'd stood by them. The restaurant overflowed with neighbors, friends, family. Marco stood in his kitchen, watching his children work beside him, and realized something profound. He'd been so afraid of losing them that he'd forgotten the most important truth. Love this strong doesn't break. Love this real doesn't disappear because of paperwork or reporters or investigations. They were a family, not because of documents or biology or legal definitions. They were a family because they'd chosen each other, and that choice had become unbreakable. 1 year after Marco bought the ruins for pennies, Romano's Legacy officially opened its doors. The name had been Luisa's idea, honoring Giuseppe while building something new. The restaurant was nothing like Marco's old Michelin-starred establishment. The floors were reclaimed wood from the original building. The walls displayed photos of the reconstruction, showing 3 people building a dream together. The menu featured dishes that told stories, each recipe a chapter in their family's journey. The opening night crowd included everyone who'd supported them. Betty claimed the best table by the window. Sarah brought her entire extended family. Old Murphy wore his only clean shirt and ordered everything on the menu. But the most important moment came when the first customer asked to compliment the chef. Marco emerged from the kitchen flanked by his children. Luisa wore a crisp white chef's coat with sous chef embroidered on the pocket. Carlos had a matching one that read Junior Chef. These are my partners, Marco announced proudly. Luisa and Carlos Valenti. Everything you taste tonight, we created together. The dining room erupted in applause. Marco watched his children beam with pride, and realized he'd never felt this successful, even at the height of his fame. 3 months after opening, a food critic from the New York Times arrived unannounced. Marco recognized her immediately. Amanda Pierce, the most feared reviewer in the industry. She ordered the tasting menu and sat alone, taking notes after every bite. Marco's old anxiety crept back. This was it, the moment that would define their future. But then Carlos appeared at her table with a small plate. "Excuse me, miss," he said politely. "Papa didn't send this. I made it special for you." On the plate was a simple dish, scrambled eggs with herbs from their garden, served with toast cut into the shape of a heart. Amanda looked puzzled. "What is it?" "Breakfast for dinner," Carlos explained seriously. "Giuseppe taught me that the best food is what makes you feel loved. You look sad eating alone, so I wanted to make you feel better." Amanda took a bite. Her expression softened. "This is delicious. How old are you?" "9, but I've been cooking since I was 8. "Who taught you?" Carlos pointed toward the kitchen where Marco was watching nervously. "My papa. He says cooking is about taking care of people." The New York Times review ran 2 weeks later. Marco read it with shaking hands while the children did homework at their corner table. "Romano's legacy defies every expectation. This is not fine dining in the traditional sense. This is something rarer and more valuable. It is food with soul." Chef Marco Valenti has created more than a restaurant. He has created a sanctuary where every dish tells a story of resilience, love, and second chances. Watching him work alongside his children, Luisa and Carlos, you witness something magical, the transformation of ingredients into hope. The arroz con pollo speaks of heritage and comfort. The seafood stew tastes like home, even if you've never lived by the ocean. But it was a simple plate of scrambled eggs prepared by 9-year-old Carlos that reminded me why I fell in love with food criticism. In an industry obsessed with technique and innovation, Romano's legacy offers something more precious: authenticity. This is what happens when cooking comes from the heart instead of the ego. No, you won't find molecular gastronomy or Instagram-worthy presentations here. What you'll find is better: food that feeds your soul and a family that welcomes you as their own. 4 stars, not for the plating or the wine list, but for creating the kind of place the world needs more of. Marco read the last line 3 times before it sank in. 4 stars, in the New York Times. But the stars weren't what made him cry. That evening, as they cleaned up after a sold-out dinner service, Luisa's phone rang. She'd been saving money for months to buy it, wanting to feel like a normal teenager. "Papa," she called from the dining room, her voice strange. "It's for you." Marco took the phone with confusion. "Hello? Marco? Marco Valenti?" The voice was older, heavily accented, speaking broken English, but there was something familiar about it. "Yes, this is Marco. Who is this?" "My name is Elena Hernandez. I am looking for my children, Luisa and Carlos." Marco's world stopped spinning. This was their biological mother, the woman who'd been deported 2 years ago. "I saw the newspaper article," Elena continued, crying. "The picture of my babies. They look so happy, so healthy." Luisa had gone white as paper. Carlos pressed against Marco's side. "Where are you?" Marco asked gently. "Honduras. We've been trying to get back. To find them. The lawyer, he showed us the newspaper. Said you've been taking care of them." Marco looked at his children. Luisa was crying silently. Carlos had buried his face in Marco's shirt. "They're safe," Marco said. "They're loved. They're home." "I know," Elena whispered. "I can see it in the picture. You saved them." That night after the restaurant closed, the 3 of them sat in their living room above the kitchen. The conversation Marco had been dreading for 2 years was finally here. "Do you want to go back to your mama?" he asked, though the words felt like swallowing glass. Luisa looked at Carlos, then back at Marco. "She's our mama, but you're our papa." "What does that mean?" Carlos spoke up, his voice stronger than Marco had ever heard it. "It means we have 2 families now. One that made us, one that saved us. Your mother and father, they love you. They want you back." "We love them too," Luisa said. "But Papa, we're not the same kids who got left behind. We're different now. We're your kids too." Marco felt his heart breaking and healing at the same time. 6 months later, Elena and Roberto Hernandez stood in Romano's legacy, watching their children work in the kitchen they now called home. The reunion had been beautiful and heartbreaking. Tears, apologies, forgiveness. But also the recognition that too much had changed for things to go back to how they were. Elena watched Carlos explain a recipe to a customer with the confidence of a born chef. She watched Luisa manage the front of house like she owned the place. "They're not children anymore," she said to Marco in Spanish. "They're young adults with their own lives." "They'll always be your children," Marco replied, "just like they'll always be mine." They'd worked out an arrangement that felt right for everyone. Elena and Roberto would stay in Gulls Bay. Marco helped them get legal status and jobs at the restaurant. The children would have both their birth parents and their chosen father. Not a traditional family, but a real one. One evening, a year later, Marco stood in his kitchen watching 4 generations work together. Elena teaching Luisa her grandmother's tamale recipe. Roberto showing Carlos how to fillet fish the way his grandfather had. 3 parents, 2 children, 1 family. A food blogger approached Marco. "Chef Valenti, when are you going for that Michelin star? This food deserves recognition." Marco smiled, looking around his kitchen full of love and laughter. "I already have the most precious star in the world." "What's that?" Just then, Carlos ran up and hugged him around the waist. "Papa, Mama Elena says I can help her make dessert tonight." The blogger looked confused. "I don't understand." Marco ruffled Carlos's hair and pointed to a new sign hanging above the stove. Not Giuseppe's old motto, but a new one written in a child's careful handwriting. "Papa, the best title a chef can earn. That," Marco said, "is my Michelin star." Today, Romano's legacy isn't just a restaurant. It's a symbol of what's possible when love overcomes loss. Marco never got his 3 Michelin stars back. He got something better. A family that chose each other and a community that chose them all. Luisa is now 16, applying to culinary school, and managing the restaurant's social media with the skill of a marketing professional. Carlos is 12, already creating his own recipes, and has never met a customer he couldn't make smile. Elena works as head prep cook, finally able to watch her children grow up. Roberto maintains the building and tends the herb garden that supplies the kitchen. And Marco? Marco cooks with more passion than he ever had when he was famous, because now he knows the secret ingredient that makes food truly extraordinary. Love, always love. The man who bought a storm-destroyed shack for pennies didn't just find a restaurant. He found redemption, purpose, and proof that the most precious things in life can't be bought. They can only be chosen. Every night, when the last customer leaves and they clean the kitchen together, Marco looks around at his chaotic, beautiful, chosen family and knows he's living his greatest recipe yet. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing true stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.